You are sitting in a room full of certainty. Maybe it is a church, maybe it is a classroom, maybe it is a family dinner table, maybe it is just your own mind. Someone says something about God that everyone around you seems to accept without hesitation. And then, for a brief moment, a strange thought appears, not because you want it to, not because you are rebellious, not because you are looking for an argument. It simply appears. How do I know that is true? The question lasts only a second. You push it away, most people do, because the question is uncomfortable, not because it automatically destroys belief, not because it proves anything, but because it quietly exposes something many of us spend our lives trying not to notice. The difference between what we know and what we assume we know. Think about how many ideas entered your mind long before you were capable of evaluating them. Ideas about right and wrong, ideas about success, ideas about love, ideas about yourself, ideas about the meaning of life, and, for many people, ideas about God. None of this means those ideas are false, but it raises an unsettling possibility. What if some of the things we feel most certain about are actually the things we have examined the least? That possibility is difficult because certainty feels safe. Human beings crave certainty. We crave maps, we crave explanations, we crave answers that allow us to sleep at night. The unknown has always frightened us. A child asks what happens after death. An adult asks why suffering exists. A grieving person asks why someone they loved disappeared. A lonely person asks whether any of this has meaning. Questions like these create a kind of pressure inside the human mind. And whenever pressure appears, we instinctively search for relief. Sometimes that relief comes through religion, sometimes through philosophy, sometimes through science, sometimes through relationships, sometimes through ambition, sometimes through distractions. Different people choose different paths, but beneath all of them is often the same human desire: to make sense of existence, to feel anchored in a universe that can seem overwhelmingly uncertain. What makes this especially difficult is that every generation inherits stories from the generations before it. Some stories are wise, some stories are incomplete, some stories are symbolic, some stories are literal, some stories survive because they are true, others survive because they are comforting. And distinguishing between those possibilities is rarely simple. That is why certain questions follow humanity across centuries, not because they are easy, because they are impossible to fully escape. Why are we here? What is consciousness? What happens when we die? What is God? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how much of what I believe is the result of my own understanding, and how much is the result of the environment that shaped me? If this question has ever crossed your mind, even briefly, leave your perspective below. Not because there is a single correct answer, but because almost everyone wrestles with it at some point, whether they admit it or not. The strange thing is that doubt is often portrayed as the enemy of belief. Yet throughout history, some of the deepest thinkers, philosophers, theologians, and seekers treated doubt very differently. Not as destruction, as investigation, not as rebellion, as curiosity, not as the absence of faith, as a willingness to look deeper. Imagine someone standing at the edge of an ocean at night. They can only see a small section of the water. Everything beyond that disappears into darkness. Human understanding often works the same way. We see fragments. We build explanations. We create models. We construct meaning. But the horizon remains. And no matter how intelligent we become, the horizon never completely disappears. That realization can be frightening. It can also be liberating. Because maybe the greatest danger is not uncertainty. Maybe the greatest danger is becoming so certain that we stop asking questions entirely. The person who never questions may feel secure. But security and truth are not always the same thing. And sometimes the most important discoveries begin with a simple moment of discomfort, a moment when an old assumption no longer fits as neatly as it once did, a moment when the answers that once felt sufficient begin to feel incomplete, a moment when someone realizes they are not searching for arguments, they are searching for honesty, and that search can change everything, not because it guarantees a particular conclusion, but because it forces a person to confront something many spend their entire lives avoiding. The possibility that reality may be larger, stranger, deeper, and more mysterious than they were ever taught to imagine. There is a moment that happens to more people than most are willing to admit. It rarely happens during a debate. It rarely happens while reading a philosophy book. It rarely happens when someone is actively trying to challenge their beliefs. Instead, it often arrives unexpectedly. A hospital waiting room, a funeral, a divorce, a betrayal, a sleepless night, a season of loneliness that seems to stretch endlessly. A moment when life refuses to behave the way it was supposed to. Everything felt understandable when the world made sense. Then suddenly, the world stops cooperating, and the questions return, not because a person wants them to, because reality brings them back. A person prays for something with complete sincerity. Nothing changes. Another person never prays at all. Everything seems to work out. Someone who appears kind suffers terribly. Someone who appears cruel prospers. Someone spends years trying to do the right thing and feels abandoned. Someone else seems to stumble into opportunity after opportunity. None of these observations prove anything, but they create tension, and the human mind hates unresolved tension. That is why people often rush towards certainty. Any certainty. A simple answer feels better than a complicated mystery. Yet life repeatedly demonstrates that many of the deepest questions refuse to fit inside simple answers. Perhaps that is where one of the biggest misunderstandings begins. Many people grow up assuming that certainty is the goal, that the ideal state of mind is reaching a place where no questions remain, no ambiguity remains, no mystery remains. But look carefully at the people who spend their lives exploring the deepest questions. The philosophers, the scientists, the mystics, the thinkers, the seekers. Many of them arrive at a surprising realization. The more they learn, the more aware they become of how much they do not know. A child often feels certain. An adult often feels complexity. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in discussions about God. For some people, God becomes a complete explanation. For others, God becomes a complete rejection. Yet both positions can sometimes hide the same psychological temptation, the temptation to eliminate uncertainty. Because uncertainty is exhausting. Human beings want solid ground. We want final answers. We want a conclusion that permanently closes the case. But what if some questions were never meant to function that way? Think about the people who have profoundly shaped history, not because they possessed certainty, because they possessed curiosity. They were willing to remain uncomfortable longer than everyone else. They were willing to sit inside unanswered questions. Most people run from uncertainty. Some people study it. Most people demand conclusions. Some people explore possibilities. And that difference changes everything. Consider a memory from your own life, a belief you once held with complete confidence. Maybe it was about another person. Maybe it was about yourself. Maybe it was about how the world worked. Then something happened, new information appeared, a different perspective emerged, an experience changed your understanding. Suddenly the thing that felt obvious no longer felt obvious. The interesting part is not that you were wrong. Everyone is wrong sometimes. The interesting part is how convinced you felt before discovering that possibility. That realization can be unsettling, because it reveals a difficult truth about human psychology. Confidence is not always evidence. Sometimes confidence is simply familiarity. The things we hear repeatedly feel true. The things repeated by trusted people feel true. The things surrounding us from childhood feel true. Again, this does not make them false, but it does mean that certainty alone cannot tell us whether something is correct. And this raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if much of human conflict begins when people confuse certainty with understanding? History is filled with people who were completely convinced. Different religions, different philosophies, different political systems, different ideologies, different cultures, different worldviews. Many of them contained sincere individuals. Many contained intelligent individuals. Many contained compassionate individuals. Yet they often reached dramatically different conclusions. Why? Because human beings do not merely process information, they interpret it. Through emotions, experiences, fears, hopes, traumas, communities, identities. The lens matters. And perhaps one of the most difficult questions any person can ask is this: What if I am seeing reality through a lens I did not choose? Not because someone forced it upon me, because every human being inherits lenses. Every human being inherits assumptions. Every human being inherits stories. The challenge is not avoiding that reality. The challenge is becoming aware of it. If you strongly disagree with this idea, explain why below. Some of the most valuable conversations begin with disagreement rather than agreement. Now imagine two people looking at the same mountain. One stands on the northern side, the other stands on the southern side. They describe what they see. Both descriptions are real. Both descriptions are incomplete. Neither observer sees the entire mountain. Human understanding often resembles this situation. We encounter fragments. We encounter perspectives. We encounter experiences. Then we attempt to construct a complete picture. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we do not. The danger emerges when we forget the difference. When a fragment becomes the whole. When a perspective becomes absolute certainty. When a personal experience becomes universal proof. This is where many people become trapped. Not by ignorance, by overconfidence. Because overconfidence closes doors. Questions stop. Investigation stops. Growth stops. Curiosity stops. The search ends before it truly begins. Yet reality has a strange way of reopening those doors. Life eventually presents something that does not fit. A contradiction, a tragedy, a mystery, a transformation, an experience that refuses to remain inside the existing framework. And then a choice appears. Protect certainty or investigate further. Neither path is emotionally easy. One risks discomfort, the other risks stagnation. Perhaps that is why so many people spend years feeling caught between opposing impulses. Part of them wants answers. Part of them wants truth. The problem is that answers and truth are not always identical. An answer can end a conversation. Truth often expands it. An answer can create comfort. Truth can create discomfort before creating clarity. An answer can feel final. Truth often feels deeper the closer you approach it. And maybe that is the realization slowly emerging beneath everything we have explored so far. The question is not whether your current understanding of God is correct or incorrect. The question is whether you are willing to examine the foundations beneath that understanding. Because sometimes the most important discovery is not finding a new answer. Sometimes it is discovering that the original question was larger than you ever imagined. And that realization leads directly into the most unsettling possibility of all. The possibility that what people are really searching for when they search for God may not be what they think they are searching for. Imagine spending your entire life looking for something and only realizing at the very end that you may have been looking in the wrong direction. Not because you were foolish, not because you were dishonest, because you were human. Because every human being begins life inside a story they did not create, a language they did not choose, a culture they did not design, a family they did not select, a set of assumptions they inherited before they were old enough to evaluate them. And yet, despite all those differences, something remarkable appears again and again across history. People continue searching. They search through religion. They search through philosophy. They search through science. They search through relationships. They search through achievement. They search through pleasure. They search through status. They search through knowledge. And beneath those countless forms of searching, there often seems to be a deeper hunger that refuses to disappear. A hunger for meaning. A hunger for significance. A hunger to understand what this experience of being alive actually is. That hunger is difficult to describe because it does not always appear in obvious ways. Sometimes it appears as ambition, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as obsession, sometimes as loneliness, sometimes as an endless feeling that something is missing, even when everything appears successful from the outside. You achieve the goal, you reach the milestone, you buy the thing you wanted, you finally arrive where you thought happiness lived, and then something unexpected happens. The feeling fades, not immediately, but eventually. And suddenly a new target appears, a new achievement, a new solution, a new answer. The cycle begins again. Many people spend years believing they are chasing one thing when they are actually chasing something deeper. Recognition becomes a search for significance. Success becomes a search for meaning. Control becomes a search for certainty. And certainty itself may become a search for security in a reality that often feels uncontrollable. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because the deeper question may not be whether everything you know about God is wrong. The deeper question may be whether the word God has become a container for countless different human needs, fears, hopes, assumptions, experiences, and interpretations. When two people use the same word, they are not always describing the same thing. One person may imagine a source of comfort. Another may imagine a source of judgment. One may imagine infinite love. Another may imagine ultimate justice. One may imagine mystery. Another may imagine certainty. One may imagine a personal presence. Another may imagine the fundamental reality behind existence itself. The same word, completely different meanings. And perhaps that is why so many conversations about God seem to go nowhere. People often believe they are discussing the same idea when they are actually discussing entirely different concepts. The disagreement is not always about the answer. Sometimes it begins with the question itself. Sometimes it begins with assumptions that remain invisible. And invisible assumptions are powerful. They shape perception without announcing themselves. They influence conclusions before evidence is even considered. They guide attention. They filter experience. They determine which possibilities feel reasonable and which feel impossible. Most people notice the beliefs they hold. Far fewer notice the assumptions beneath those beliefs. Yet those assumptions may shape everything. Think about moments when life completely changed your perspective, not because someone argued with you, because reality confronted you. A loss, a breakthrough, a relationship, a crisis, an unexpected act of kindness, a profound experience you cannot fully explain. Those moments often transform people because they bypass intellectual arguments and force a deeper encounter with reality. Suddenly the world looks different. The same facts exist, but the interpretation changes. And once interpretation changes, everything changes. Perhaps that is why some of the most meaningful realizations in life do not arrive as answers. They arrive as better questions. Questions that expand awareness rather than narrow it. Questions that create humility instead of arrogance. Questions that remind us how vast existence truly is. The older many people become, the more they discover that reality resists simplistic conclusions. Human beings are complicated. Consciousness is complicated. Suffering is complicated. Love is complicated. Meaning is complicated. Existence itself is complicated. Yet there is something strangely beautiful about that complexity, because complexity invites humility, and humility creates space for curiosity. Curiosity creates space for learning. Learning creates space for transformation. The moment a person becomes convinced they already possess every important answer, transformation often stops. The search ends. The questions disappear. Growth slows. Yet life seems to reward those who remain open, not gullible, not naive. Open. Open to evidence. Open to experience. Open to reflection. Open to the possibility that reality may still contain something they have not yet understood. This does not require abandoning beliefs. It does not require adopting new ones. It requires honesty. The willingness to look directly at uncertainty without immediately demanding relief from it. That willingness is rare. Most people want immediate resolution, immediate certainty, immediate closure, but some of the most profound questions in human existence refuse to provide immediate closure. They ask something else from us: patience, reflection, humility, courage, because it takes courage to admit what you do not know. It takes courage to examine assumptions. It takes courage to investigate ideas that feel emotionally important. It takes courage to remain curious when certainty would be easier. And maybe that is the final twist hidden inside this entire discussion. The title creates one expectation. The journey reveals another. Maybe the most dangerous mistake is not believing the wrong thing about God. Maybe the most dangerous mistake is believing that any human being has completely captured a reality that may be larger than human language, larger than human concepts, and larger than human understanding. Maybe the mistake is confusing our descriptions with reality itself, confusing the map with the territory, confusing our interpretation with the thing being interpreted, confusing familiarity with truth. That possibility can feel threatening at first, but it can also feel freeing, because it removes a burden many people carry without realizing it. The burden of pretending certainty, where certainty does not exist. The burden of acting as though every mystery must already be solved. The burden of defending conclusions they have never fully examined. What if genuine understanding begins where intellectual performance ends? What if wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of our perspective? What if the search itself contains value? Not because searching guarantees answers, because searching transforms the person doing it. And perhaps that is why these questions continue to survive generation after generation. Not because humanity keeps failing to answer them, because they keep revealing something important about the human condition, our longing for meaning, our fear of uncertainty, our desire for truth, our struggle with mystery, our endless attempt to understand where we came from, why we are here, and what, if anything, lies beyond the horizon of everything we currently know. The uncomfortable possibility is not that everything you know about God is wrong. The uncomfortable possibility is that reality may be far more profound, mysterious, and difficult to reduce into simple formulas than any of us would like to admit. And if that is true, then the most important question is not what answer you leave with. It is whether you are willing to keep looking, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep confronting the mysteries that make us human. Because sometimes the greatest transformation does not happen when a person finally finds certainty. Sometimes it happens when they discover the courage to face uncertainty honestly for the first time.